Hello, I'm Paul Smith. I want to talk to you about the heart of Christianity, which I understand and experience as a transforming friendship with Jesus. Christianity is a major force in the world today. When we look into our longing for this world to be a more loving and compassionate place for all, over 2 billion individuals on the planet currently claim to be attracted to the teachings and actions of Jesus. Yet, many feel that their relationship with the Christian church of whatever brand, Catholic, Protestant, Orthodox, liberal, conservative, charismatic, or any of its other hundreds of denominations, is challenged by the ethical, moral, and financial scandals that often plague Christian organizations. In addition, many often find Christianity difficult to understand and make it meaningful in their lives. If you long for a more direct relationship with what it truly means to be a Christian, I am suggesting that you consider a transforming friendship with Jesus. Whether you're a man or a woman, young or old, whoever you are, this friendship with Jesus can take your Christian spiritual path and practice into a whole new dimension. We'll come back to these images later on after we open up the new meaning they can carry and how it might work in your life. Let's begin with a history of Christianity in 10 seconds. Christianity began in Palestine as an experience. It shifted to Greece and became a philosophy. It arrived in Italy and became an institution. It went to Europe and became a culture. It moved to America and became a business. While this little history may be a bit of a caricature, it contains an important truth. Christianity was an experience before it became a religion. What was this experience? I understand that it was the transforming friendship Jesus had with a few others. Jesus summed it up in his famous words to those closest to him. I no longer call you servants, but I call you friends. Real friends. Jesus had real friendships with those closest to him. Real conversations. Real love and caring and genuine affection. Can you take Jesus out of the stained glass window and see him, for instance, with Peter in a real relationship, a real friendship, as they lived, worked, and traveled together in joyful companionship? By contrasting the idea of servants with the notion of friends, Jesus was pointing to a more intimate kind of relationship that master-servant suggests. Echoing modern sensibilities about grown-up adults to adult healthy relationship, he was aiming at a meaningful partnering friendship while working together in healing the world. I began my friendship with Jesus in one sense before I was born. My parents enrolled me in the church nursery called the Cradle Roll of their Water Tower Southern Baptist Church in St. Louis in 1937, while my mother was still pregnant with me. So I was Baptist born, Baptist bred, and expected someday to be Baptist dead. Early on, I was fascinated with the story of Jesus and the early Christians that my Sunday school teachers presented. I was a 12-year-old kid who asked my Sunday school teacher why our church didn't seem like the church in the New Testament. The older I grew, the more I was dissatisfied with my church. I suspected there was more to being a Christian, and I wanted it. As a teenager, I was reading theology books like the philosophers in Greece, seeking more answers to who God was and who I was. As a 20-year-old university student, I became a part of that institutional church formalized in Italy, working as a choir director and church organist. That's me in the center of a Christmas Eve service, playing the pipe organ with 2 feet and 1 hand, while waving the other at the choir. I was a part of that church culture that began in Europe, spending most of my time outside of university classes immersed in the life of my church. I had lots of beliefs about God, but no actual experience of God. I longed for that mystical relationship with God that I had read about in the New Testament. The only people I knew that had actual experiences of God were part of the emerging charismatic movement of the 1960s. They were the educated, toned-down Pentecostals of a previous generation. I began hanging around them with their over-the-top exuberant worship and prayer. At age 22, I attended a prayer retreat of Episcopalian charismatics. I liked Episcopalians. They seemed sane and intelligent, even with their visions, healings, praying in tongues, and hearing words from God. They invited me to sit in the center of their prayer circle so they could pray for me. An African-American woman, a pastor's wife, said, "Oh my, we got our hands on a Southern Baptist preacher boy." I just about ran out then. I had my spiritual brakes on as they prayed for me. After all, I was a Baptist preacher, and I had everything I needed, thank you. 2 weeks later, sitting in my room reading an Agatha Christie murder mystery, I began to feel something strange. I was suddenly and unbelievably in love with everything and everyone, with the walls of my bedroom, with the book I was reading, with Agatha Christie. I loved my dysfunctional parents. I even loved the Catholics. At that time, Baptists and Catholics did not love each other. This transcendent experience lasted for an hour, the effects of it for a lifetime. However, it was to be a long time before I had any more of this more that I had been longing for. As the next few years passed, I continued to develop a passionate devotion to Jesus and something of an inner flow of prayer and praise and worship. Right after finishing seminary at age 25, I was called to a midtown Kansas City Southern Baptist church called Broadway Baptist Church, where I would pastor for the next 49 years. There, I was the young progressive Baptist preacher who ditched his coat and tie on Sunday mornings 5 decades before it became popular, and drove around in my sporty Corvette. That always felt a little weird, driving behind the hearse in funeral processions. The chairman of the deacons said to me in later years, "We should have suspected right away you were not going to be a normal Baptist preacher." Not being a normal Baptist preacher continued when I realized that everyone, regardless of their religion or no religion, was a child of God, made in God's image and likeness, and destined for heaven. I wrote a little book called Hell No, a Bible study on hell, why no one will be left behind. The first picture on the cover is the popular view of hell, which Jesus referred to as Gehenna. Gehenna was a real place, the city garbage dump just outside of Jerusalem in Jesus' day. The second picture is an actual photograph of that same garbage dump today. It's a really nice park. What happened to all that eternal fire? I went on to lead the church into ordaining women and calling God Mother in such sermons as, "Would you recognize God if you saw her?" I invited the lonely crowd of Sunday morning into small groups, where over 400 of our members gathered together in homes around the city on a regular basis and shared and prayed for one another. Some of these groups are still meeting 50 years later. Spending that much time caring for one another eventually led to us openly welcoming the gays in our midst who had previously hidden their sexual orientation. This last one brought the culture wars to our front steps. The infamous Westboro Baptist Church that had picketed the funerals of gay men began picketing us on Sunday mornings with their offensive signs. In 2004, we were kicked out of the Southern Baptist Convention for performing gay unions. In the last of my almost 5 decades at Broadway Church, we made one more liberating change. I became fascinated by the approach of the American philosopher and best-selling author Ken Wilber, and we began to delve deeply into what he called integral spirituality. It gave me a framework for understanding not only Christianity, but all the religions and spiritual paths of the world. For years, I had been aware of 3 different spiritual paths about God that are found in the world's religions today. Even within Christianity, there are those that think God is so vast and infinite as to be beyond our understanding. Then there are those who are confident that God showed up close to us as Jesus in a way that Jesus is actually still with us today. And finally, there are those who believe that we are all made in the image of God, and God is found within each of us. I could make a case for each of them. A big, infinite God, a close, intimate God, an inner God, a you God. Which one was true? When I applied the integral framework to Christianity, I found a fascinating, simple pattern in Jesus' life and teaching that opened up the doors of my understanding. Amazingly, I then felt free to, without hesitation, embrace all 3 of these approaches to God. Which one was true? They were all true. God is big. God is close. And God is the inner you and me as our deepest true self. Each of these dimensions of God is a part of the truth and needs the others to be all of the truth. This pattern, which I saw in Jesus' life, can be summed up in 12 simple words. These 12 little words led me to a transforming friendship with Jesus, and my life has not been the same. Here are those 12 words. Jesus talked about God, to God, and as God. And then he said, so can you. We will talk about that part later on. He talked about a big God. When Jesus said things like, blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God, who was this awesome God of the Jewish tradition that they would see? Jesus talked to a close God. Who was this intimate God that Jesus talked to, saying, Abba, not what I want, but what you want? And then Jesus talked as God from his deepest self. Who was this inner you God that Jesus referred to when he said, I am the light of the world? Jesus talked about God, to God, and as God. All of us were taught this pattern in elementary school, even if we didn't realize it. It's encased in every modern language as the 3 basic perspectives from which we view everything. Our school teacher said that third person is talking about something and someone, using third person language. We are talking about the alphabet today. Second person is talking to someone, like, it's good to see you. It's when we connect with someone. First person is talking as yourself, using first person words like I or we. I feel a little lonely today. That's when we are describing our own feelings and thoughts. These are the 3 basic perspectives in looking at anything in life. Looking at something from these 3 different perspectives means we see 3 different things. Let's look at God through this cosmic sphere of perspectives. Jesus talked about God, to God, and as God. It is in this larger framework of about, to, and as applied to God where we're going to locate a transforming friendship with Jesus. I have found that if I don't put my friendship with Jesus into this larger framework for progressive folks, they understandably tend to dismiss what I say about Jesus. This is because I use some of the same religious language and images that traditional Christianity uses. if they don't see that I am using these words and images in a different context, it sounds to them just like a Baptist preacher talking about that old personal relationship with Jesus stuff. You're probably too smart to do that, but just in case, I'll outline this cosmic expanded picture of God, which can open us up to a more integrated experience of ultimate reality. Let's begin with Jesus talking about God. When he said, "Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God," who were they going to see? He talked mostly about this God in personal fatherly, motherly terms like Abba. Jesus not only talked about this close God, but he talked about God as the inner true self of every human being. And I will do both in a minute. But first, let's focus on the big God behind the fathering, mothering, close God that Jesus talked about. This was the vast God of his Jewish heritage, who is the ground and source of all that is. This face of God was stunningly glorious and mystically luminous, and actually could not be seen at all in the conventional sense. At the burning bush, Moses heard God say, "Do not come any closer. Take off your sandals, for the place where you are standing is holy ground." What followed is one of the most important passages in the Torah for every Jewish child and adult in Jesus' day. God wanted Moses to lead the people of Israel out of their captivity in Egypt. Moses asked God, "Whom should I say is sending me?" God said, "I am that I am. Say that I am has sent you. That is my name forever." The awesome God of Jesus asked to be known simply as I am. What does this mean? Great Christian thinkers down through the centuries have seen that God's name as I am meant that God was not described as a being, but in a much, much bigger way, actually in an infinite way. This face of God was not a being, but being itself. Immensely influential 13th century philosopher and theologian Thomas Aquinas said, "God is absolute primal being." 13th century German theologian and mystic Meister Eckhart said, "God is pure being." Famous 20th century philosopher and theologian Paul Tillich said, "The being of God is being itself." This infinite God of existence, or being itself, is definitely not the big God up there in the heavens of Michelangelo. Rather, this is the vast, awesome, infinite big God who is behind Jesus' Abba. This is the face of God that is being itself. We are the beings. I ask myself, what image, what symbol could I use to help communicate this vast I am God, this ultimate reality that was simple being itself? I found this one helpful for me: infinite space, a metaphor for the life, love, and light of infinite being. All symbols have limitations. This one communicates the vast infinite spaciousness of I amness. What it does not communicate is that I amness is empty space, filled with the magnificent loving potential of all creation. It is beingness without content. Let's try to get at that by pulling back the universe to reveal an infinite, empty space. This face of God is not a being, but being itself, is represented by the vast, empty space of beingness which holds everything else. Paul referred to this infinite face of God as the one in whom we live and move and have our being. This is a God so big that it Ultimately, it defies mere words or images. Let's call talking about God, who is I am infinite being, as Jesus talked about the infinite face of God. Let's refine this a little more, since Jesus did more than talk about God. Let's say Jesus reflected about the infinite face of God. Jesus not only talked about God, but he talked to God, saying, Abba, not what I want, but what you want. He didn't relate to God in abstract terms or concepts like the infinite face of God. He experienced the face of God that was very close to him in prayer, in personal and intimate ways. This face of God was so close to him that he used the surprising and unusual name for this dimension of God that I mentioned earlier, Abba. This was the name in his native Aramaic tongue that both children and adults used as a term of endearment and respect for their fathers, meaning something like our term Papa or Dad, used by children and adults today. Let me pause here to talk about gender, which takes on new meanings in our modern day. Jesus used the word Father as a personal metaphor for God. God is not actually a literal father, but rather like a father. The general meaning of father in Jesus' day included father as the corporate personality of the family, which included mother in a way that is not true today. Today, father does not in any way include mother, but rather distinguishes father from mother. Most importantly, Jesus was not designating a gender for God, but rather the nature of his relationship to God. In today's gender-conscious world, father implies male, rather than Jesus' sense of a protective and personal, loving, parental relationship. This is why I translate the word father in the New Testament as father, mother, just as the inclusive version of the New Testament from Oxford University Press does. It is then that father, mother reminds us that Jesus was using a metaphor about closeness, not gender. Today, some Christian authors are portraying God as feminine as well as masculine to give a more complete picture of the image of God, including both male and female. My friend Lucy Sink painted this picture of God as feminine spirit breathing the breath of life onto earth. So I call Abba the fatherly, motherly presence of God. Let's take this perspective of talking to God and add this symbol for the motherly, fatherly presence of God to represent Jesus' sense of God as a close, loving parent. Since Jesus did more than talk to God, let's say that Jesus related to the intimate face of God. It was a close relationship of love and trust. Finally, Jesus talked as God, saying, I am the light of the world. He said, God and I are one. He said, if you've seen me, you've seen God. He didn't mean his physical body or particular personality was God. Jesus meant if you looked into his deepest self, there you would find divine, infinite being itself. He was doing more than talking as God in the Gospel of John and acting as God in the Gospel of Matthew, Mark, and Luke. He was identifying as God. He rested as God in his deepest self. Let's say that Jesus rested as the inner face of God. When Jesus said, before Abraham was, I am, he was stating his identification with God, who told Moses that the divine name was I am. He was experiencing his deepest self as transcendent, divine, I am consciousness. Since I'm quoting passages from the Gospels like, before Abraham was, I am, The question often comes up, did Jesus really say that? While it is interesting to speculate about this, I usually don't differentiate between what may be Jesus' words and what may be the words of the risen Jesus coming through those closest to him in time and history. There is no way to absolutely know for sure who said what. However, most scholars believe that the four Gospels let us know quite a lot about Jesus. We can add the recently discovered wonderful Gospel of Thomas, whose core was written very early and gives us a vibrant picture of the evolutionary breakthrough that was modeled in Jesus. This is not to say we should accept every word in the four Gospels or other writings as what Jesus did and said. What is critical for me is to discern whether the words look, sound, and smell like the loving Jesus I know and experience. I do with my Bible what Jesus did with his Hebrew Bible in relationship to the God he knew and experienced. He embraced some parts of his Bible. He ignored some parts of his Bible. And he rejected some parts. He specifically rejected any words about a supposed vengeful God or words that said we should hate our enemies, like God is pictured many times in the Bible, killing people or threatening to punish them forever. This is not the God Jesus talked about. He said that God is love, and we should love our enemies. We must join Jesus and reject the un-Christ-like parts of our Bible. So Jesus reflected about the infinite face of God. He related to the intimate face of God. And he rested as the inner face of God. I can't emphasize enough that we need all three faces of God. To fully integrate all three faces of God gives us an infinite face of God that is big enough to be beyond us, an intimate face of God that is close enough for our hearts to love, and an inner face of God who is us enough to be our very own core identity. Let's get back to our central focus. Jesus related to the intimate face of God. I focus on the intimate face of God in a transforming friendship with Jesus because it is the heart of Christian spirituality. It's not the mind of reflective Christianity, nor the inner spirit in resting as God of the Christian path, but it is the loving heart of following Jesus. I think for many thoughtful people interested in spirituality, Jesus is the least understood and least experienced dimension of the Christian path. I want to offer you a way to understand and personally experience this life-changing friendship. The intimate face of God for the first followers of Jesus began with the breakthrough fatherly, motherly, spiritual presence of God. But something more developed after the resurrection of Jesus. His followers had been transformed by their friendship with Jesus as he walked and talked with them. They sensed the presence of God when he was with them. But now Jesus was no longer present in physical form. After the resurrection, they discovered an amazing thing. Now Jesus walked and talked with them in a spiritual form, an energy body, a non-physical body that seemed to them as real as Jesus was in his physical body. Now they understood why Jesus acted as if he was God and spoke as if he was God in his time of public ministry. They could now know God's presence in Jesus' presence with them again. Let's let this symbol represent Jesus' non-physical energy body, his spiritual body, as Jesus risen from the dead. Sometimes they saw him. Sometimes they simply heard him or felt his presence. but he was always experienced as really there, especially in prayer and worship. This was so profound and real that within a few years, perhaps even months, the first Christians were offering the risen Jesus the same devotion and worship that they gave God. They embraced Jesus as divine, as God with them in human form. The early Christians experienced the radiant, transcendent presence of Jesus as the presence of God. This was an astonishing evolutionary development for these early Jewish followers of Jesus. To actually consider that a human being could be so identified with God that he was seen as divine like God was divine. Remember that their religious tradition said that God was so far removed from creation that one should not even create an image that represented God, much less see a human being as represented the image of God. Pliny, the imperial representative to the Emperor Trajan in 112, reported it in a letter to the emperor. They were accustomed on a stated day to meet together before it was light and to sing a hymn to Christ as to a God. So let's put this symbol for the mystical, luminous, risen Jesus also in the intimate face of God's space. For us today, just as for the first Christians, Jesus is not only a historical figure who once walked and talked in the land of Palestine. He is now walking and talking with his friends as the risen Jesus in a real body, but not a material one, but rather, as Paul says, a spiritual one, or what we can call an energy body that continues to transmit the presence of God. Now to the next amazing part. Jesus said, "So can you. So can you rest as God in your deepest self." Jesus could say, "I am the light of the world," because he identified his deepest self as divine. But Jesus also said, "You are the light of the world," because he knew that our deepest self was also divine, just like him. At one point, the religious leaders accused Jesus of blasphemy because he claimed to be one with God. His defense was that they should not be surprised that he was one with God because of his powerful ministry. After all, he said, "Even you are God's too." The second letter to Peter talks about our divinity, saying, "So you may become participants in the divine nature." Like Jesus, we can talk about God, to God, and as God. Like Jesus, we are the voice and heart and the hands and feet of God in the world today. Like Jesus, we can reflect about the intimate face of God. Thinking is a sacred activity. It's the way we love God with our minds in ordinary, everyday consciousness. Like Jesus, we can relate to the intimate face of God. Relating to God is not a belief, but an experience. It is the practice of a deeper, subtle, mystical consciousness of authentic friendship with God. Finally, like Jesus, we can rest as the inner face of God in oneness or unity consciousness, seeing no separation between us and God and us and one another. Jesus rested in his identification with God, and his actions flowed from this inner realization of the oneness of all things. This is not a belief system. This is a series of realizations which awaken us to a new level, a state of transcendent consciousness where we experience being one with God. Here we can accept and experience Jesus' claim in John 10 that we are all God's. We can say with the 13th century German theologian and mystic Meister Eckhart, the eye with which I see God is the eye with which God sees me. My eye and God's eye is one eye, and one sight, and one knowledge, and one love. When we identify with our divine center, we can then flow with divine energy into the world from the deepest part of ourselves. This is transcendent consciousness. I found out early on that Baptists, like many Christians, have a difficult time with the inner face of God. Jesus may have said that we're all gods, but they don't take that part of their Bible literally. I tell them I'm not suggesting they wear a t-shirt like this, but I'd consider wearing one like this. I am infinite being. It reminds me of the poet Hafid's words, when you are lonely or in darkness, I wish I could show you the astonishing light of your own being. God appears in you as you. This is your one-of-a-kind, fullest expression of your true self. Now, even though I talk about a personal relationship with Jesus, do you understand why I shouldn't be confused with a traditional Southern Baptist when I talk about God? I hope so. Now let's focus on relating to the intimate face of God. I have found this happens most powerfully in a transforming friendship with Jesus. As my friendship with Jesus grew and deepened, I saw that others had found this too. Leslie Weatherhead was a liberal Protestant English pastor and theologian from the early 20th century. He wrote about how complicated Christianity must seem to many people. His answer to that perception was this: I think the essence of the matter might be stated by saying that Christianity is the acceptance of the gift of the friendship of Jesus. He was echoing the earlier 16th century Spanish mystic and Catholic saint Teresa of Avila, who said, if Christ Jesus dwells in a person as their friend and noble leader, that one can endure all things, for Christ helps and strengthens us and never abandons us. He is a true friend. Prominent, controversial, outspoken critic of social injustice and liberal American minister of the early 20th century, Harry Emerson Fosdick, said, the steady discipline of intimate friendship with Jesus results in us becoming like him. In 2015, Roman Catholic Archbishop Samuel Aquila of Denver said, to abide in Christ means to enter into a relationship of friendship with him. Human formation finds its fulfillment in that friendship with Christ, which is at the heart of spiritual formation. Richard Rohr, a Franciscan priest and inspiring writer and friend, said, in Jesus, God took human form, human face, human eyes, and human endearment. God is finally someone we can fall in love with. God was given a face and a heart in Jesus. Marcus Borg, New Testament scholar, fellow of the Jesus Seminar, and major figure in historical Jesus scholarship, said, being a Christian isn't primarily about having a correct theology by getting our beliefs right. It is about a deepening relationship with God as known especially in Jesus. How does this transforming friendship work? The Apostle Paul was convinced that Jesus was resurrected bodily, but his body was now in a spiritual form and not a physical one. It was no longer limited by time and space. We see this again and again in the New Testament. Stephen, while being stoned, saw Jesus and prayed, Lord Jesus, receive my spirit. Jesus appeared to Ananias in a vision and spoke to him. Paul fell to the ground and heard the voice of Jesus speaking to him. Paul continued his conversations with Jesus. For instance, when he talked about his thorn in the flesh, saying, 3 times I talked to Jesus about my thorn in the flesh. Jesus said, my grace is sufficient for you. While praying in the temple, Paul fell into a trance and saw Jesus speaking to him. The book of Acts also details the account when Peter fell into a trance, filled with images and the voice of Jesus. In all of my New Testament studies for years, I never saw or heard anyone call attention to the fact that the word trance is used 3 times in the book of Acts. Not only did my teachers not talk about trance, they didn't talk about the mystical transcendent states of consciousness that the word trance was describing. It wasn't until I began having my own trance experiences that I realized this is what was being described there. Early Christian prayer and worship was trance worship, like 1 Corinthians described. And this painting depicts of a Christian gathering from the ancient catacombs of Rome. They look like a bunch of charismatics with their hands in the air. Paul had visions and revelations of the Lord in a higher state of consciousness. John wrote the entire strange and fascinating book of Revelation, describing the vivid vision of Jesus with 7 candlesticks he had while in an elevated state of consciousness or trance. Down through the centuries, the saints and mystics have had deep and often ecstatic relationship with Jesus in prayer. St. Francis of Assisi, the best known and most honored of all the Catholic saints, heard Jesus on the crucifix say to him, "Francis, repair my church." Over the course of 20 hours, 14th century mystic Julian of Norwich had 16 visions of Jesus. She eventually wrote a book, the first woman to do so in the English language, about those visions. What was going on in all of this? One of the most interesting conversations Jesus had with his friends after his death was while 2 of them were walking along the road to the city of Emmaus. These 2 were joined by a 3rd person whom they did not recognize. I love this painting by Janet Gerloff. Notice how she paints Jesus' 2 friends, and then how she paints Jesus. Jesus was there walking with his friends, but not in the same form as his friends. She captures the whole idea of Jesus' friends being in their ordinary, everyday bodies, and Jesus being in his spirit body self. Jesus had a physical body self and a spiritual body self. The one is outer, the other is inner. At his physical death, his physical body self died. It was his spiritual body self that returned to connect with his friends. It took a while for Jesus' 2 friends here to recognize this apparently unknown person as they moved from their ordinary consciousness into a higher spiritual consciousness. Then they recognized the stranger as their friend, the risen Jesus. Like Jesus, we also have a physical body self and a spiritual body self. Our deepest self, our true self, is not a physical body self, but what Paul calls a spiritual body self, an energy field that is identifiable as us. Like all friends of Jesus after the resurrection, our friendship with him does not take place in the physical realm. It takes place in the spiritual realm. Our friendship with Jesus is a reality and takes place in the ontologically real realm of our spiritual energy bodies. This kind of friendship in the spirit realm can appear challenging because it requires us to grow in our ability to go beyond ordinary everyday consciousness and become conscious of our spirit body self and with Jesus' spirit body self. That's what this talk is about. In the last 50 years, researchers have begun to study the experiences of others with a reality beyond the physical. At the psychic level, sensitive mediums can pick up information from the energy field of departed loved ones to share with others. There are now numerous compelling studies of the out-of-body experiences of people leaving their physical body in surgery. Researchers have collected thousands of experiences of what appear to be counts of past lives as a form of spiritual body self. Near-death experience studies with those who return after brain death have shown the life-changing effect of connecting with other non-physical beings in the numinous realms of transcendent consciousness. Added to the mixture are the shared death experiences where several persons have the same mystical experience in the presence of a dying loved one or a dead person, such as the appearance of Mary at Medjugorje. It was there that 6 children began having simultaneous visions of Mary in 1981, which they continue having today as adults. Researchers used EEG and other scientific equipment during their visions and found their eyes, voices, and body movements all synchronized during the visions while they saw Mary and heard her speak. In the last few decades, academic researchers have collected the experiences of thousands of people living today who have had ADCs, or after-death communication, usually with those they were close to. This seems to be one part of those subtle spirit-body-self information fields. Here's a contemporary documented one involving 2 famous Christians. In his little book, Ring of Truth, the English biblical scholar and translator J.B. Phillips shared a significant event in his life that happened in 1963. The late C.S. Lewis, whom I did not know very well and only seen in the flesh once, but with whom I had corresponded a fair amount, gave me an unusual experience. A few days after his death, while I was watching television, he appeared, sitting in a chair within a few feet of me, and spoke a few words which were particularly relevant to the difficult circumstances through which I was passing. He was ruddier in complexion than ever, grinning all over his face, and as the old-fashioned saying has it, positively glowing with health. A week later, this time when I was in bed reading, he appeared again, even more rosily radiant than before, and repeated the same message, which was very important to me at the time. Later, Phillips reported that the message was, "It's not as hard as you think, you know." Phillips had been in the middle of a deep depression, and after he saw C.S. Lewis and heard these words, his depression lifted. Notice the similarity to Jesus' appearances. Lewis appeared large as life and natural. He spoke. It was a transforming experience for Phillips. I'm amazed at the number of people in my former congregation over the years who shared with me when they found out I didn't think they were crazy to talk with the dead. They would say, "I never told anybody else this, but..." There are many valuable ways to pray. I want to offer what I have found to be the most transforming practice of prayer. I call it sitting with Jesus. This has been my practice for the last dozen years. It is a psycho-spiritual technology. It involves our psychological dimension, our spiritual dimension, and an actual practice or technology, a specific way of doing something. It has 6 different parts that have emerged for me. I encourage you to actually do each of these after you watch this video. This is not only something to hear about, it is something to do. It begins like this. First, welcome the presence of Jesus. In sitting with Jesus, we begin by welcoming the presence of Jesus, or use the name of another beloved personal presence of God you are connecting with, such as Mary, Sophia, loving mother and or father, For historical considerations and simplicity, I will continue to use the name of Jesus here. Actually say out loud or silently something like this: "Thank you, Jesus, for being here with me." If your attention wanders as you sit with Jesus, gently return to his presence. This brings up an important question. Is anybody really there when we pray? Our modern culture has narrowed what many considered real down to the physical world only, and dismissed the spiritual realm without any actual proof that it is not real. Of course, thinking people must ask, how do I know this is true? The genius of the modern world is that it has given us the scientific method to distinguish between fact and fiction, between ontological reality and mythical fantasy. Here's the startling news. The scientific method can actually be applied to spiritual phenomenon to demonstrate that non-physical realms can also be real. The scientific method itself can help determine the validity of any spiritual experience. Here are the 4 elements in the scientific method. First, experiment. You do this experiment. You do this practice. You try it out. Second, you experience something. You observe what happens within you when you do this practice. Third, evaluation. You compare what you observe to others doing the same practice with what's called peer review. And fourth, evidence. You conclude there is or is not evidence that this practice opens people up to a reality beyond the physical. In addition to the paranormal research I just mentioned, for the last 2,000 years, millions of people like myself have done the experiment of experiencing the presence of Jesus. We've reported what we've experienced. We've evaluated it. We have concluded that Jesus is really there in spiritual form, not as a mere belief, but as real as anyone's presence that we can experience in physical form. For many of us, Jesus is an unseen but clearly felt presence. That's how I experience him. However, God comes to us in whatever form we need or recognize as meaningful. A divine motherly fatherly presence, the divine feminine, Mother Mary, or other spirit guides. All of these are experienced as the felt presence of all-embracing love. Those from other traditions may experience the divine presence as Krishna or Buddha or other personal forms. This means any authentic experience of God's loving presence is always shaped by our need and interpreted by our cultural setting and present stage of spiritual growth. It's uninformed to argue that Buddha or Krishna cannot convey a sense of ultimate or divine reality, because they can. It's even more uninformed to argue about how Jesus really looks today to his friends, because he looks like whatever we need and our present stage of spiritual growth allows. We need not be concerned about the details of Jesus' appearance, but rather the dynamic of his cosmic but personal presence with us and all around us. Some people's transcendent spiritual experiences can be quite dramatic. Let me tell you about my friend Jita. Here she is in Pune, India, doing japa meditation with beads, the Hindu repetition of a mantra. She's a well-educated, well-read woman who contacted me from India one day after she'd read an article about me. As we talked, she told me about her experience of attending a Christian school as a young girl. She was about ready to give her heart to Jesus when one night she woke up and saw Krishna in all of his blue-skinned glory standing at the foot of her bed. The room was flooded with love. She gave her heart to Krishna that night and has been a happy Hindu in the ensuing years as the wife of an airline pilot and mother of a daughter. I affirmed her decision to follow Krishna. A few years later, she called and posed a question to me. Could she be both a Hindu and a Christian? I said, well, of course. It sounds like something interesting has happened. She said the previous evening she'd been reading in her study when Jesus appeared to her, standing before her and radiating tremendous love for her. She spontaneously opened her heart to him and decided to not only be a follower of Krishna, but also a follower of Jesus. Hence her dilemma and her question. I told her that one of my favorite theologians, Ramon Panikar, says that he became a Hindu and a Buddhist without ever ceasing to be a Christian. I didn't see why she couldn't be a Christian without ever ceasing to be a Hindu. She now lives as a happy Christian Hindu. I tell you about her to once again point to the power of the presence of God in the form of a beloved deity with whom we connect heart to heart. Heart-to-heart devotion is the one crucial ingredient in sitting with Jesus. So let's make it step number 2. Connect heart to heart by crossing the devotional threshold. Jesus brings the heart center to the spiritual path. Nothing happens in sitting with Jesus prayer without moving into your heart and making a heartfelt devotional connection to Jesus. Heart passion and devotion is the bridge between us and the energy field of Jesus. Ken Wilber says, one cannot just sit down and do devotion mechanically, the way you do push-ups. A threshold must be crossed to devotion authentically. You must fall in love. Trans-rational devotion, often in forms that embrace the traditions, is a natural expression of maturity. A powerful way to awaken this heart connection within you is to ask yourself this question: what would I feel if Jesus was really here with me right now? This gets me in touch with my heart. This is what moves Jesus from a figure in history to a living presence. After you've crossed the devotional threshold, there are several things that can happen. As a third step, you can simply sit quietly in mutual awareness. Someone who had traded in prayer for quiet meditation said to me one time, prayer is just too busy. Too much noise and talking, too much asking and begging and pleading. I said, so don't pray that way. He looked at me strangely and said, and how do you do that? I shared with him what I'm sharing with you now. Sitting quietly in mutual awareness is what good friends do, young or old. They can sit in silence and enjoy one another's company. You sense one another's loving presence. You soak up the love and history together. You are aware of all the things you've been through together. That's real sitting with Jesus prayer. Intensely aware of Jesus' presence, you sit quietly in that field of love and friendship. You sense that you are real to Him. He knows you are there. But we human beings also communicate with words at times. So as a fourth part of your sitting with Jesus practice, you can communicate back and forth. Traditional prayer is often in the form of asking God or Jesus to do something for us. It's always good to express our heart's desires to God. Jesus did that when He prayed that we would all be one. When praying more specifically for ourselves and others, it's even better to follow Jesus' model. For instance, Jesus never asked God to heal someone. He simply transmitted that healing energy Himself and taught His friends to do the same. He said, if you need a mountain to be moved, don't ask God to move it yourself. When I pray for others, I see them surrounded by divine light and love, and let that have its powerful effect. Traditional prayer also tends to be us talking and never listening or even expecting a response from God. But we can do both. I tell Jesus how grateful I am for his life and teaching, that he wants to be here with me, that he's devoted to me. I share whatever is going on that I need guidance and help about. I ask questions. If I don't hear an answer inside my head or heart, I assume I've asked the wrong question. I stay aware of words, pictures, or intuition that represent Jesus' response to me. In addition to various felt experiences and hearing words of guidance, many years ago I began to experience external visions, as others have often reported. These appear in front of me with my eyes shut or open. They started as stars dotting the vast universe, and it seemed I was traveling among them. Then after a while, I began to see exquisite, colorful geometric patterns, which eventually evolved to luminous white, blue, and gold waves of color that still occur whenever I am in prayer mode. This experience of colors is not uncommon at all in subtle spiritual consciousness. Later, rapidly moving images of people, nature, buildings, and objects began to appear in front of me. Sometimes I could only tell if these objects were physically present or non-physically present in spirit state awareness by putting my hand out. And my hand went through the object, I assumed it was not in the material realm. I questioned the meaning of these experiences. Was I going crazy? At this time, these didn't seem at all spiritual. I thought, well, if I could at least see Jesus, it would be spiritual. Eventually, I saw that these visions were preparing me for the dissolution of out there and in here into one non-dual sacred space. This was dramatically experienced one morning when I finished my time of sitting with Jesus and opened my eyes. The walls of the room I was in were transparent and fragile. Everything that had been solid before was now transparent. The concrete, material, physical world now did not seem as real as the subtle spiritual world of visions that I had been experiencing in prayer. Here was a new, unnerving picture of reality. The spiritual, energetic world is even more real than the physical world. This sense stayed with me for several days and was quite disorienting. I gradually accepted it as a picture of reality closer to the truth, even as science is now describing physical objects as made up of dark space and energy fields. For years, when I was talking to Jesus, it seemed to me that he, as a presence and not a visible form, was standing in front of me several feet away. One day I said, "Can't you come closer to me?" Suddenly Jesus was an inch from my face. He was so close I was uncomfortable. So I said, "Not that close." He seemed to laugh and moved from in front of me to my right side and touched my right arm. He said, "Is that okay?" I said, "Yes, that's wonderful." I could clearly feel the sensation of his touch on my arm. That touch has become a stabilized awareness that I experience continually now. I feel his touch here right now on my arm. Fifth, at some point in your friendship with Jesus, you can take another step in your spiritual evolution. You can move from talking to God as the presence of Jesus to resting as God as Jesus did. We can rest as infinite being in peaceful, empty spaciousness, not focused on any thought or object. This practice of emptiness of thought and fullness of peace has been called contemplation, meditation, or centering prayer. It is an extension of sitting with Jesus by moving your attention from Jesus to sharing the same transcendent, vast I amness that Jesus is also experiencing right now with you. There are no objects or thoughts in your awareness, just vast peace and love. You too can rest in an infinitely deep center that is not pushed around by circumstances. It is a peaceful, simple feeling of being. One more transforming step I have learned to take is this. We can identify with Jesus. This is moving into what could be called Christ consciousness. Christ consciousness is not being conscious of Jesus Christ. It is actually seeing the world as he sees it. This is seeing yourself without any separation between you and God, and you and all others. If I can identify with Jesus deeply enough, I can see the world as he sees us. This is what he called the kingdom of God, seeing everything as a love-filled, inseparable, and whole oneness. This is impossible to do as an abstraction or idea. Unity of consciousness is a felt experience, a felt sense that nothing is separate. At one point in my friendship with Jesus, I asked him to come into me and me into him in a deeper way. I saw the two of us moving toward one another. I had to work to not overthink this. I just relaxed into it. Finally, we touched, and I melted into him. I was looking at the world from his eyes. I was sensing what his heart sensed. I was aware of what he was aware of. I became him. I sensed a vast new way of seeing, a new compassion for others. The more I practiced this, the more my inner world gradually became even bigger, but this time with no separation. I began seriously entering the unity of non-dual world, of oneness with God and with others. I was literally putting on the mind of Christ that Paul talks about in Philippians. I could say with Paul, I live, yet not I, but Christ lives in me. Practicing this in a regular way awakens us to what some call unity of consciousness or non-duality. By the way, the ritual of communion, of eating the body and drinking the blood of Jesus, is an incredibly powerful metaphor and acting out drama of merging with Jesus. This can actually happen if those who participate come to it with this awareness and intention. I was giving a workshop on integral Christianity in Santa Barbara a few years ago. For much of my life, I've struggled with agoraphobia, the fear of being away from home. This is my first time traveling in 10 years. The question on my mind was, would I panic? As I sat in my hotel room facing the Pacific Ocean, I began sitting with Jesus. Suddenly I was aware that instead of being in Santa Barbara was in me. Not only did I have no fear, but instead of panic, I felt myself expanding on the inside into a blissful, vast spaciousness. As the months went by, this expanded to the experience of the entire universe in me. I continued to experience this more and more. This is the dissolution of out there and in here into one non-dual, vast, sacred space. As we identify with Jesus, he shines in and through our physical body self. This is moving from communion with God to union with God. Merging with Jesus awakens our ability to see that there is no separation between us and God and us and one another. To identify with him is to identify with an actual loving person who sees the world in unity consciousness. I remembered that passage in Revelation 3:20, where the risen Jesus says, "Here I am. I stand at the door and knock. If anyone hears my voice and opens the door, I will come in and eat with that person and they with me." I had been eating and drinking with Jesus in a transforming friendship for some time. But now it had moved much further. And then I found the most incredible description of what I had moved to in the Gospel of Thomas. Jesus is talking to his close friends, his companions. He vividly describes his offer of the deeply liberating energy of mystical transcendent consciousness. He exquisitely images it in this way: whoever drinks from my mouth will become like me, and I will become like that one, and what is hidden will be revealed. I thought, this is what's happening to me. Jesus and I are becoming alike, and hidden things are being revealed. Oh my, that sounded so very boastful. But I felt in some small way I really was becoming more like Jesus. I realized Jesus is still saying this very thing to us today. A transforming friendship allows us to drink from Jesus' presence, and for Jesus and us to become more and more alike. And hidden things will be seen. Well, we've covered lots of things to think about and explore. I hope you found something helpful in what I've shared for your own friendship with Jesus. Let whatever resonates with you be an invitation for you to personally accept this gift of friendship that Jesus offers you. Try it out right now.